Hello, and welcome to The Future is Sound, a partnership in hearing podcast brought to you by Oticon Canada. I'm your host, Becca Angel, and thanks for joining me on my first podcast journey, where we will chat broadly about all things hearing. We will launch fun new episodes every month, and if you have any suggestions or comments, be sure to get in touch. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Future is Sound. I'm your host, Becca Angel, and I'm talking to you guys today from Squamish, British Columbia. And my guest today is my good friend, my old classmate, my colleague, Melanie Monahan. And she is an educational audiologist based in Eastern Alberta. And we actually graduated together from the audiology program at UBC. I guess it feels like many years ago now, but Mel has hearing loss and she's had hearing loss from a young age. And we're going to talk a little bit about her experience and also what she's been up to since graduating school. So hi, Mel.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for being a guest on the show.
Of course.
It's been a while since I've seen you, but the last time was probably when I was visiting the area in Alberta and probably went for Mexican food or something.
Yes, we did. Yes. And there was lots of snow back then as well.
Yeah. So we're heading back into winter, but I don't get to see you as much anymore on that side.
That's true.
So you're an educational audiologist. So just for anyone listening that has heard that before, but isn't super knowledgeable on what you do or what educational audiologists do on the day-to-day, can you just fill us in a little bit on what educational audiology is and, your role in Alberta?
Sure. So educational audiology, it definitely varies based on the province and the country or state or wherever. So in Alberta, we have more of a consultation model. So I work very closely with the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing. I will also sometimes work with other teachers, such as a teacher of students who are blind and visually impaired, and a teacher of students who use complex communication devices. But for the most part, I work with a teacher of the deaf to help support children who have hearing loss in a school setting.
Right.
So instead of feeding hearing technology, I will help the teacher use that hearing technology and collaborate with audiology clinics and dispensing an audiologist.
Cool. And are typically you guys moving around from school to school? You're not really located in one place. Is that correct?
No, I believe we cover 13 different school districts.
Wow.
In rural Alberta.
Okay.
We have a very large area that we cover.
Yeah. How many on your team? How many educational audiologists are you working with?
Just mine. Just me.
Just you. Okay. So you're obviously, I want to say you're stretched thin.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Lots on your plate. And the kids that you're seeing in the schools and helping with their classroom technology and hearing aids, varying degrees of hearing loss as well. Because I know this is kind of another topic in and of itself, I guess, is kids with profound hearing loss or children in school who are deaf are going to more mainstream schools now. So you're kind of seeing the whole spectrum of different varying degrees of hearing loss for your kid caseload?
Exactly. So we cover preschool to grade 12. And like you said, it varies from mild to slight hearing losses to profound hearing losses.
Right. And are you kind of are you typically seeing, I'm wondering how many kids, I guess, would you say is on your entire caseload? I'm just curious.
we have approximately 120 students on our total caseload.
Okay. Wow.
Mm-hmm. It's a
That's a
lot.
lot.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And it's just growing every year.
Yeah. Crazy. That's a lot of students. I was definitely thinking on a smaller number. But
Mm-hmm.
I remember you being like really interested in this area, like even when we were in school. So it's really cool to see that you've kind of made that dream happen for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really excited to have the opportunity, and I feel very lucky because there's really not very many educational and audiologists here in Alberta.
Yeah. And what about teachers for the deaf? I know you work closely with them, but how many teachers for the deaf do you work with? Are they a little more in surplus than educational audiologists?
Not necessarily. In my experience, it's usually it, one teacher at the deaf to one educational and audiologist, and that's the case for my team as well.
Do you remember it being, because I know you did a placement here in British Columbia. Do you remember it being quite similar?
It was very different because in BC, when I did my placement, there was several teachers of the deaf, and there was one educational audiologist. And she would do like the more traditional testing, and she would sometimes also fit like FM and DM systems. We don't do that in Alberta because the clinical audiologists do that.
Okay, I gotcha. Right. So lots of but I assume like lots of troubleshooting and stuff on your
Mm-hmm.
end. Yeah.
Definitely. And we would quite often recommend other technology for the classroom
Yeah.
that will interface with the personal hearing technology.
Right. Yeah. Are you seeing that more? Like, are we getting mainstream classrooms equipped with more of these kind of sound fields and stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it's a lot of work for us because we have to out school to spend money, and so sometimes there'll be other systems in the room that are not compatible.
Yeah.
But it's a learning process for all of us.
Yeah. I'm always learning. I mean, when I used to come and see you guys in Edmonton or in the area, I just remember there's just always so many questions around like what's compatible with what. And it's
Mm-hmm.
a lot to keep track of.
I know. We don't make it too easy for you manufacturers, that's for sure.
Oh, that's okay. I think like it's a positive because obviously technology is changing a lot and
Mm-hmm.
things are becoming, in theory, easier to use, but I think not without its complications. Bluetooth is like a whole
Mm-hmm.
can of worms these days.
That's true.
So it's
Yeah.
like, oh, it's going to be easier to connect and it's all wireless and everything, but you're probably not seeing that. It's probably creating more headache than the opposite.
Yes and no. I am very grateful that I don't have to work with the old FM systems that I had in school because
Right.
no one wanted to use those.
Yeah. Okay. That's a kind of a good segue. Like we'll come back to where we kind of see the future of educational audiology going. But I mentioned just in your intro that you weren't born with hearing loss, but you've had hearing loss since you were about 3 years old. Is that
Mm-hmm.
right? Yeah. So maybe tell us a little bit about what happened and kind of like your experience growing up with hearing loss like that.
Sure. So I definitely have a bit of a unique history. I was deafened at 2.5 years old because I had meningitis. It was the vaccine was not available for children that young at the time. So I received my first implant on the right side about 6 months later when I was just over 3 years old. And I had 3 failures and on that side.
Three
So because
failures. Yeah.
yes.
So,
Yeah.
just to kind of interrupt. So, what year was that? What year did you get your first implant?
It was in 1991.
Okay.
It was the same year they were approved for pediatrics in Canada.
Okay, I was gonna say, like,
Mhm.
was it approved? You would have been one of the first, probably.
I was, yeah.
Wow.
So I mean, like the surgical techniques have improved a lot since then. And I also had other changes when I had meningitis because I had a lot of cochlear ossification.
Yeah.
So yeah, that right implant really was not very successful. I received my left one when I was 16 years old. And because it was a little bit later when I received that one, I didn't hear it as well
Yeah.
as when I was implanted for the first time on the right side.
And right. It's like all coming back to me. But so from the time that you were implanted like 3.5 and then it failed 3 times, like, were you hearing at all? Like between like 3.5 to 16 when you had the left implant? Like, what was that like?
That's a really good question. So I actually did extremely well with the first two implants. So
Okay.
I had my first failure when I was 5 years old, and the second when I was 10. So I heard really well from 3 to 10 years old with those implants. And then I
Right.
didn't hear so well from age 10 to age 16.
Yeah.
Because they were not able to fit the whole implant electrode array into my cochlea.
Okay. Just like a portion.
Mm-hmm.
And you were like, I know you have siblings, right? You have a sister
Mm-hmm. And a younger brother as
and
well.
a younger brother.
Mm-hmm.
And were you going to regular school then too? Like, I'm thinking about like a 10-year-old who's having trouble hearing with normal hearing siblings in a regular school. Like, that must have been really tough.
Mm-hmm. It was tough. Yeah, I had a full-time educational assistant basically from the time when I was in kindergarten to grade 12, and they were a pretty good signer.
Okay.
So it's not that I had interpretation, but they definitely provided some sign support.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
And then like deciding, I guess, at 16 to get implanted, was that a family decision? Did you have a big say in wanting to do that? Like, it probably would have been pretty scary.
It was definitely my decision.
Your decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I can't see myself choosing differently because I did not have a strong deaf identity at the time. Because as you know, like cochlear implants were very controversial
Yeah.
in the 90s. So yeah, I've never had the opportunity to become fluent in ASL and to immerse myself into deaf culture. I always considered myself to be a hard of hearing. And I have my friends who had cochlear implants, my family who was normal hearing, and my school of friends who were normal hearing. So it's a really easy choice for me.
Right. Yeah. I guess you sort of grew up quickly with, not grow up quickly, but like you grew up kind of in the more or less in the hearing world, despite
Mm-hmm.
having a profound loss and really probably struggling a lot of the time. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I always do wish that I had that opportunity to learn more about the deaf culture and be more fluent in ASL when I was a child. Like, I can always pursue that now, but
Yeah.
it's much harder to learn a language as an adult.
I know. Well, I remember like we had ASL interpreters in our class for you and another classmate. And I remember just wishing that I knew like ASL. And it was something that like I don't even really remember really knowing much about like growing up. It's not something that is really introduced. At least it wasn't introduced to me when I was in school. I actually had a friend whose mom was deaf when I was in elementary school. And I remember like they were signing. And that was like my only kind of like introduction to it at a young age, which is interesting like to think about, because it is a language. And it's almost like unless you're exposed to it a lot, you honestly don't really even know like that it exists in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I had a family on the podcast recently, and she had her daughter. She's a twin. She's 5 now, but she was maybe not born with hearing loss, but she was diagnosed with hearing loss at like age 3 as well.
Oh.
But she can wear traditional hearing aids. And they were like curious about not necessarily deaf culture, but just curious about other forms of communication. Like if the hearing loss were to get worse, if the hearing aids were to break, like if she wanted to immerse herself in a different culture, like how do we go about learning ASL? And I just thought it was really a good idea. I was like, I think you guys should definitely do it. Like it's a fun thing to do as a family. And yeah, I feel like we should encourage that.
I agree with that. And there's way more other options now. Like there's all kinds of deaf and hard of hearing organizations where people can take classes and they can meet other people who have hearing loss.
Right. Yeah, I said that too.
We didn't have that in the 90s.
Yeah. Like how old were you when you met your first friend that also had hearing loss?
Yes. Yeah. That was when I was first diagnosed. It was before I was implanted. So my parents took me to a camp where there were families who had deaf and hard of hearing children. And that was where we met my current best friend, Tyler.
Oh, okay.
Who also has a hearing loss and a cochlear implant.
I think I've met Tyler once.
You did.
Yeah.
He's fun.
Super fun. Oh, well, that's really nice. Like that you had that early on. I thought you were going to say like, some people it might be like in high school or something where they're like,
No, my parents they're always really good with encouraging those connections.
Yeah.
I actually had several friends who had implants when I was in elementary school. And those friendships just kind of continued.
Yeah, that's nice. It's good that they did that.
Yeah, it's very important. I think it was Phonak was one of the first portable FM systems. I found that highly embarrassing. And I kind of just said no more FM until I went to grad school at UBC. And they showed me the Roger pen, which is much smaller. Yeah. It's very similar to what Otakon has now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like much smaller, much more discreet.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't admit that to my students very often because I want them to use their DM systems.
Yeah.
Which is the newer version of FM.
Yes.
But I definitely understand how embarrassing it is when you're a teenager.
Yeah.
And you don't want that extra attention to yourself.
It makes sense. And like, I think too, that we're trying to take away that stigma. So it's like, we want to avoid using words like, oh, like you're not going to see it, or it's going to be super discreet, or like, no one's going to notice. It's like, we want to be able to talk about hearing loss more in the sense that it's actually really common and, not something that we need to hide.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And
I'm seeing that with the personal hearing devices as well, because people are much more willing to experiment with colors. We're seeing people who have dark hair, they're wearing great cochlear and implant processors, which is what I have.
Yeah.
Like when I was in school, I'd always go for the beige and brown colors. because I was trying to hide it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, do you think, I don't know, do you think like social media has had a positive impact on that? Like, I think it does, but like, what do you think? I just feel like so many videos and like advocates for hearing loss can be like broadcasted a lot easier on these
Mhm.
platforms. And it can be like a really good thing for the industry, I think.
Oh, definitely. hmm Yeah, and that's something that I didn't have when I was growing up either. Like even on popular TV shows like The Bachelor and like Love Island UK, like there were these two like gorgeous girls who had cochlear implants. I was like, wow, if I had seen that in high school, it would make such a big difference.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. Like, as kind of negative social media can be for teens and adolescents, it can also be like a really positive thing
hmm
too when it's kind of used in the right way to advocate for things like that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And like, what do you, I don't know, like, I can't really remember from school, but like, do you think you were a big advocate for yourself growing up, or would you have liked to have been a better advocate and done things differently?
I could have definitely been a better advocate. I was pretty shy when I was in school. And I also definitely relied on the adults around me to advocate for me. So
Yeah.
that's something that I try to work on with my students now, because it's just so much easier when you grow up knowing how to do that, as opposed to having to learn it when
Yeah.
you leave home for the first time.
Yeah. Like, what do you think the industry can do to be, or like even like me as like a normal hearing person who is an audiologist who's like immersed themselves in this industry? I'm always wondering like how I can be a better advocate too, like for not just hearing loss, but obviously the topic of hearing loss today.
Mhm.
Um, like, what do you think that we can do better to kind of advocate for our colleagues that have hearing loss?
I like that question. So something that I've definitely come to realize is that even though I do this for a living and I advocate for my students every day, it's incredibly hard to advocate for myself. So I say I still struggle with feeling guilty if I have to ask for something. So I would say like that's probably the biggest thing that people with normal hearing can do, is just to listen to us and to speak up. If you identify a weakness somewhere, like for example, if you go somewhere and you see that there's no interpreters and there's no captioning where there should be, perhaps you could suggest that.
Yeah.
So, like for example, a lot of the Alberta COVID updates, they did not have live captioning. They had interpreters, but not live captioning.
Right.
So I emailed them about it, but it would make more of a difference if more people and also emailed about it.
Yeah. It's like, it seems so obvious now, but it's not always so obvious at the time. And it's like just
No.
making ourselves more in tune with like what should be obvious. you know, like, I think we've gotten a little better lately. I think like big thanks to you guys too. Like, I remember we had one of our original virtual symposiums and probably didn't have ASL interpreter, and the captioning was probably like really bad or didn't work, I think, failed. And I remember like you had gotten in touch with me to be like, I basically couldn't participate because I, couldn't hear and I couldn't see what was going on. So I think like, I don't know, I think you are a pretty good advocate for yourself.
Oh, thank you.
Um, but it's in turn, it like makes us do better too. Cause I think we've made big improvements in terms of like having ASL interpreters and captioning as like a default for a lot of our symposiums now, which is not something that used to be the case, which like is too bad, cause like it's 2022, but I don't know, as long as we're always making improvements, I think that's the most important. Like,
for sure.
Probably, do you think like COVID and the pandemic had a real impact on these types of things where you're like on these virtual meetings and they don't have, accessibility there?
Yes. As difficult as the pandemic was or is, we get everyone wearing masks and it's hard to hear. I did feel that it was also a blessing because it really forced all of the virtual platforms. So like Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, and Zoom to step it up. Because previously it was just Google Meet that had captioning. And it was not very good. But now it's much better. And other platforms also have the automated captioning.
Yeah, like I find the one for
Zoom,
the Zoom one is pretty good.
Yeah, it is quite good.
Yeah, and we touched on this just like briefly before, but like some of the positive changes that we've seen like in culture that you think is helping. Like obviously they're having more people with hearing loss as like participants on shows and stuff to kind of increase awareness there. But what else do you think has been like a really positive change in the more recent times for kids with hearing loss?
So in 2020, an American Girl, they released their first doll that has a visible disability. And she wears a hearing aid in 1 year. I thought that was very cool.
Yeah.
And I actually had the opportunity to take that doll to a kindergarten classroom. And as soon as I pulled it out, the student with hearing loss just lit up.
Oh,
like she was so happy to see this doll that also had a hearing aid. And it was beautiful to see it.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah. And Barbie also just came out with a doll that had hearing aids as well.
Oh, really? Is that newer? I didn't know about the Barbie one.
Yeah.
Oh,
it's
cool.
called Barbie Fascinatas number 187.
Okay, cool.
And we've also been recommending all of our elementary schools that have students with hearing loss to purchase one because it's only like $11. It's so cheap.
And so easy to implement. I think Lego as well. Like we had done a couple of like little Lego people with like hearing aids and glasses, which is like, feels like so minor, but it's like these big companies like American Girl and Barbie and Lego just implementing a small change can make a huge difference for some of these kids.
I love that. Yeah. It really promotes self-acceptance and it also normalizes the disability.
Cool. Okay. So as we like try and wrap up more or less, I think it's been like almost 30 minutes. I was just wondering like tips and things from your perspective on like what makes a good audiologist or like hearing care professional. Like in your experience, you've obviously, been through a lot with your hearing and you've probably seen lots and lots of different healthcare professionals. So I don't know, what's your take on like some takeaways for being a good clinician?
I like that question. So I would say probably definitely a sense of empathy, a willingness to listen to a patient's concerns and the family, and being open-minded. So we always say in my job that if you've met one person with hearing loss, you met one person with hearing loss. You should never take what applies to one person and generalize it to others.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah.
I was sorry to interrupt. It's funny you say that because Liv, Olivia Mariano, who we had on the podcast, like early, one of the first episodes, said the exact same thing about Down syndrome. She's like, if you've met one person with Down syndrome, you've met one person with Down syndrome. So it applies like across all disabilities, which is, I think.
I love that.
Yeah, she said the same thing.
So true. The last thing I was going to say is just be open-minded, because not everybody will choose the same communication modality, or they might not choose if they want to wear hearing aids or cochlear implants. They might want to only wear them sometimes. And I think that's hard for us. I know it's hard for me because I always want to wear it all the time.
Yeah.
But wearing it sometimes is better than nothing if they want to wear the implant or cochlear implant. So I try to be open-minded about that.
Yeah.
You should edit that part. I said implant or cochlear implant.
Oh, yeah. Hearing aids or cochlear implant. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think it's like we want to fix everything sometimes, and just knowing that, maybe not everything can be fixed 100% all the time. So a little is better than nothing, for sure. And then I guess like my last question would just be kind of like your hopes and dreams for educational audiology. Like, you're obviously very busy, you have a huge caseload. I'm sure that applies across provinces. Like, I don't think you are alone in feeling that way, and like, how busy you are. And in a perfect world, like what improvements would you make, and like how can you see it improving in the future?
So there's not a whole lot of buy-in for these services. I would love to see it be more consistently applied. So if there was more funding for it, not only in Alberta, but all provinces, because it's kind of a niche career. Actually, I shouldn't say that, but it's called a low incidence disability for a reason. There's not very many students who require our services in the whole picture.
Right.
Or that's how schools see it, and that's how the government sees it. So it would just be nice if there was more buy-in for services, and if there was both an educational audiologist and a teacher of the deaf to work with the student.
Yeah.
Sometimes there's only one or the other, and they can fall through the gaps.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of like pertinent timing considering what's happening in Ontario right now to be recording this, just with all of the, educational assistants and stuff walking off the job. Like, it's sad that there's not more support from the government.
Definitely.
Across each province. Even though it's happening in Ontario, it very much could happen here or in Alberta too. So
yeah, I think it's easier to see how much it costs in the short term, but if you only look at that, you're also ignoring the long-term benefits.
Yeah,
because people who are deaf and hard of hearing, they have one of the highest rates of unemployment. So we can change that by providing these services when they are in school.
Yeah, 100%. And also, like, well, it's like anything about preventative measures, right? It's like anything that you do after the fact always costs more money. Like, look at the pandemic, right? Like, we were so unprepared for that. And so, yeah, I listened to a podcast recently about being like, I forget the term now, but just like a leader who's in a preparedness mindset versus a reactive one. So I think it applies to this too. Like, the more we can do for kids at a younger age to help them prepare for the future and advocate for themselves and all of that, I think in the long term, it's a better investment.
Definitely.
Yeah. Cool. Well, any last thoughts on your behalf?
I guess I could say that, like, going back to the advocating for people with hearing loss, I think it would be good if we could advocate more for our patients. So not a lot of people realize this, that there's often more funding for ASL interpretation, because a lot of people who are normal hearing assume that people who are deaf and hard of hearing all know ASL. And that's actually not the case. Most of us are not fluent in ASL.
Right.
And a lot of us require other accommodations, like captioning or hearing loop systems. So, yeah. and those things, they're unfortunately not always funded. I think partly because of that lack of awareness of the various needs of people who are deaf and hard of hearing.
Okay. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Cool. That's like a tangible thing we can take away.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
No problem.
Thank you again for coming on.
Thanks for having me. That was really fun.
Hopefully we'll see you soon.
Sounds good. You too.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, or leave us a review. You can also register for our Partnership in Hearing community website using the link in the description below.